Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take the pile of sources you provide, the historical analyses, the constitutional texts, the comparative legal studies, and distill them into a powerful, actionable understanding of the world.
And today we are tackling a huge one. It's maybe one of the most fundamental principles of human governance, state accountability.
Right. It's the mechanism that really determines whether a society holds together or, just collapses under the weight of its own power.
Exactly. We're diving into some fascinating material today, specifically Zahir Ahmad Mir's comparative study, and it asks a really core question. How do history and law make sure that power doesn't just devolve into corruption?
And the scope of this deep dive is, I have to say, pretty astonishing. We are tracing this whole concept of accountability, the mechanism for tracking every dollar, every single decision from 7th century Arabia.
Right at the very beginning where the first state treasury was established.
All the way through to the massive institutional checks that were developed in 20th century Washington, D.C.
And then we bring it right into the present day, looking at how it all manifests in modern Pakistani jurisprudence.
What's really remarkable and what stood out to me from the sources is this profound ethical and, operational thread that connects these wildly different eras.
It's an incredible thread. We're shifting from the earliest, most rigorous act of personal self-accountability by a head of state, something driven almost purely by moral duty, to these highly institutionalized, adversarial, modern oversight systems driven by statutory law.
So our goal for you, the learner, is to walk away with more than just a list of dates and names. We really want to give you a robust conceptual framework.
A shortcut, really.
A true shortcut to understanding how this principle, this idea that no ruler is above the law, has been established and, more importantly, enforced across such radically different societies and political structures.
And this whole journey, it really starts with defining the stakes. As the source material argues, accountability is basically the engine of legitimacy. We need to be crystal clear about the binary choice facing every government throughout history.
It's a stark choice.
It is. Power without accountability becomes corruption. Full stop. But power with accountability, that becomes leadership. And we're going to examine the incredibly difficult path that leaders and institutions have to take to stay on that latter side of the ledger.
Okay, so let's unpack this framework. And the best place to start is with the ultimate historical benchmark that the source material gives us.
The starting point for everything.
It's the earliest recorded act of voluntary financial accountability by any head of state. And this takes us all the way back to the early 7th century. We're talking about the moment immediately following the Prophet's passing and the inauguration of the very first Caliph, Abu Bakr al-Siddiq.
And this historical context is just so critical to grasp. You have to picture it. This was a moment of profound, rapid transition. They were moving from a decentralized tribal structure to a unified, exploding state.
It's all new. The rulebook is being written in real time.
In real time. So establishing clear financial and ethical standards for governance right at this precise moment was absolutely essential for the survival and the legitimacy of this nascent state. The ethical bar had to be set impossibly high right from the jump.
And Abu Bakr's initial response to taking on this immense power, it wasn't to, move into a palace or start consolidating wealth. It was actually to try and keep his day job.
Precisely. It's almost unbelievable from a modern perspective. When he became the first caliph, assuming this immense political and religious authority as leader of the Ummah, his immediate reaction was just pragmatic austerity. He literally continued working as a simple cloth merchant for his livelihood.
Just stop and think about that. The head of what was becoming the largest political entity of its time is still showing up at the market every day to sell goods just to feed his family.
It speaks volumes about his mindset, doesn't it? That public service was a duty, a burden, not a source of private income.
But that setup, it was completely unsustainable. With the demands of running a state, how could that possibly work? How did the community, the companions, address this fundamental conflict?
Well, this is where that community intervention becomes so foundational to this whole concept of public trust. The companions, they urged him to stop trading.
And what was their argument? Was it about status? Like, this doesn't look right.
No, and that's the key. Their argument wasn't about status or dignity at all. It was about efficiency and dedication. They argued, you are the Caliph of the Muslims. Your time belongs to the Ummah.
Wow.
It's a foundational declaration. The people were essentially claiming ownership over their leader's time and his intellectual capacity. They were ensuring the state would function without distraction. The state's needs, they argued, completely superseded the leader's private economic needs.
Okay, so if they demanded his full, undivided attention for the state, then the state had a corresponding duty to provide for him. But the sources are very, very clear that this provision was highly restricted.
Oh, extremely. This was an immediate mechanism to prevent any opportunity or even the perception of an opportunity for private gain. This led to the state treasury, the Beit al-Mal, setting a modest stipend.
And we really need to emphasize what modest means in this context.
We do. It wasn't just, enough. It was specifically defined as only enough for his basic needs, bare subsistence. The sources highlight that this established a standard of deliberate austerity for all future leaders. It was accountability engineered through extreme financial limitation, basically signaling that public service was its own reward.
Let's just pause on the Beit al-Mal for a second. For our listener, this wasn't just some random cash box. This was a revolutionary idea, right?
Absolutely revolutionary. It was the institutionalization of the state's centralized finances, making them totally distinct from the ruler's personal fortune.
That distinction is paramount.
It is. Before this, in so many societies, the ruler was the treasury. The state's money and the king's money were completely interchangeable. The establishment of the Beit al-Mal created a separate, dedicated legal entity just for public funds.
And its rules, starting with this very first caliph's modest stipend, they defined public money as something sacred.
As a sacred trust asset, an amana.
Okay, so this brings us to the astonishing conclusion of his life,
Right.
which just crystallizes this entire concept of self-accountability. What happened on his deathbed?
This is the moment. This is what sets the eternal ethical standard. As Abu Bakr neared death, he engaged in this radical self-audit. He specifically dictated a transaction to clear his account, so to speak, with the state treasury. His request was incredibly specific.
Oh, was it?
Return the camel and the land I used from state resources.
It wasn't just a general donation to charity or something vague. It was an itemized list.
An itemized list of tools or assets he had used during his tenure that he felt exceeded that modest stipend. The camel, the land, these were probably means of transport or maybe some minimal agricultural support related to state function. But he recognized they were derived from public resources and he wanted them returned.
So the specificity is the point. It's not just a nice anecdote. It's a legal and a moral precedent.
Exactly. He made sure that everything, down to the very tools he used for his office, was accounted for. And his intention, which gives us the motive behind the act, was explicit. He said, "I will meet Allah with nothing belonging to the treasury."
A zero balance.
This radical concept of achieving a zero balance with the state before his death is the reason this is globally cited as the earliest recorded act of voluntary financial accountability by any head of state. No one asked him to do it. No law compelled him. He demanded it of himself.
So how did the next generation of leadership react to this? I mean, this is an unbelievably high standard to set. Caliph Umar's response when he received the returned assets is often cited as this moment of profound political and moral gravity.
It is deeply, deeply insightful. When Umar received these returned assets, the sources tell us he just wept. His tears weren't just sadness for his predecessor. They were an acknowledgement of the incredible political burden that had just been placed on him and on all subsequent rulers.
And his famous quote really captures that.
It articulates it beautifully. He said, "You have made it difficult for those who come after you."
That quote is the establishment of the legacy itself. It's a recognition that while this standard is morally necessary, actually maintaining it requires this monumental, almost superhuman discipline from every leader who follows.
It becomes a sunnah, a guiding practice for governance. And this single historical act, it distills the 4 absolutely foundational pillars of governance that the source material identifies. And these are the pillars that travel across all 3 of our case studies.
Okay, let's break those down. These are the foundational principles we need to carry forward in this deep dive.
First, the big one, the overarching theme. State power is fundamentally a trust. An amana, it's not a right to rule, it's a temporary sacred duty.
And from that trust follows the second principle.
Exactly. Based on that trust, the rule of law is absolute. Every official is accountable, without exception, regardless of their position. Third, the ethical standard for handling the money. Public money is sacred, totally distinct from private wealth.
And the fourth pillar, the one that really contrasts so sharply with our later examples, is this expectation of proactive integrity.
Yes. Leaders must audit themselves before they are audited by others.
That's the crux of it.
It's the whole foundation. Accountability was established here through internal integrity, radical transparency, and a profound self-accountability driven by moral duty and religious conviction. The leader set the standard for the state, which completely reverses the typical historical dynamic where the state has to, compel or constrain the leader through external force.
We've established this incredibly high moral bar, the internal voluntary self-audit driven by the concept of amana. Now, let's make that massive conceptual leap.
A huge leap.
We're jumping 13 centuries forward and crossing the Atlantic to see the modern institutional reflection of this exact same core principle, but in a radically different political context.
Right.
U.S. Watergate, from 1972 to 1974.
And this transition, it really demonstrates the evolution of accountability mechanisms. The ethical standard, the core idea, the sanctity of public office, it remains identical. But the execution, how you enforce it, shifts entirely.
Right. It goes from an internal moral obligation to external systematic constitutional enforcement.
That's the shift.
So for those who might only know Watergate in passing, just to recap, the crisis stemmed from an illegal break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. But the real issue was the massive cover-up that followed.
A massive cover-up involving illegal wiretapping, political espionage, and the systematic misuse of executive power and state agencies, the FBI, the IRS, to target political opponents.
But what defines this crisis in our context of accountability, it isn't the initial crime itself. It's the institutional response to the attempted cover-up.
Precisely. Unlike in the 7th century, where the community had to rely on the caliph's conscience, the U.S. system activated its constitutional checks and balances. The U.S. Congress, specifically the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, launched these massive, televised oversight hearings.
So this was an institutional resistance to the abuse of executive power, mandated by law.
Mandated by law. This resistance wasn't based on some kind of moral plea to the president. It was based on the Constitution's separation of powers. This difference in foundation moral trust versus, you could say, legal distrust is just profound.
Legal distrust, that's a great way to put it.
It is. The U.S. model essentially presupposes that power will be abused and therefore builds in these structural safeguards. Congressional oversight, with its power to subpoena records and testimony, becomes the primary mechanism to enforce that principle. It shifts the burden of proof from the conscience of the leader to the institutional requirement of transparency.
And the principles that were enforced during this whole period, they're really the hard-won modern echoes of that ancient concept of trust. The material identifies 3 core institutional principles that Watergate brought into incredibly sharp focus.
The first one, and this became a foundational declaration of American political life, is that no president is above the law. This is the ultimate institutionalization of accountability. It proved that even the chief executive has to yield to judicial and legislative scrutiny.
And the second principle, it mirrors amana conceptually, but it uses this very concrete legal language.
Yes, it says public office is a trust, specifically a fiduciary duty, not personal property. It explicitly bars using state resources or executive authority for any kind of private or political gain. It's a legal firewall.
And the third principle identifies the structural imperative, the how.
Right. Congressional oversight is essential for accountability. The argument is that without a powerful, independent legislative body armed with real investigative power and, crucially, the willingness to use it, the executive branch will, by its very nature, always expand beyond its legal limits.
The contrast in how this all got started is just stunning. In part 1, the leader initiated accountability by returning assets.
And in part 2, the oversight body had to aggressively investigate, compelling disclosure through the threat of impeachment and criminal proceedings. It's a complete inversion.
And that necessity, that forced disclosure, gave rise to one of the most famous investigative questions in legal history. It basically defines the entire era.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
Can you analyze that question for us? What makes it so powerful?
That phrase is the institutional hammer. It's a question rooted entirely in criminal and legal responsibility. It's focused on the timeline of the cover-up and the president's direct role in obstructing justice.
So it's not about his personal virtue at all.
Not at all. It fundamentally contrasts with Abu Bakr's statement, "I will meet Allah with nothing belonging to the treasury." One is an internal moral commitment. The other is an external legal mechanism designed to force a chain of command disclosure. The focus is on verifiable facts, on paper trails, on who is responsible.
And the outcome was historically monumental. It completely reshaped American political norms, detailed the direct consequences for us, the ones mentioned in the source material that prove these institutional checks actually worked.
The consequences were far-reaching and they were permanent. The immediate fallout included widespread criminal indictments, the conviction of very high-level officials, numerous resignations from the top of the executive branch, and of course, the big one.
Nixon's resignation.
The unprecedented resignation of a sitting U.S. President Richard Nixon under the looming and certain threat of impeachment. This proved, beyond any doubt, that the constitutional framework possessed the necessary teeth to compel accountability at the absolute highest level.
And beyond the immediate scandal, the long-term effects were about strengthening the entire system, right? What lasting institutional changes were mandated after Watergate?
Well, the legacy of Watergate is really the proliferation of a stronger accountability infrastructure. We saw the strengthening of ethics rules across the entire federal government, the mandated establishment of more rigorous audit systems within every agency, and the passage of critical transparency laws.
Like the Freedom of Information Act.
Exactly. Amendments to the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, were designed to make executive operations much more visible to both Congress and the media. The system essentially corrected itself by reinforcing the very idea of structural accountability.
So if we connect the threads here, Watergate really becomes the modern institutional mirror image of that 7th century moral imperative.
It is the ultimate parallel. The source material argues that the core ethical demand is completely non-negotiable in both systems. The ruler must answer to the people.
It doesn't matter how they answer, just that they do.
Precisely. Whether that answer is given voluntarily out of a sense of integrity or it's forcibly extracted under subpoena and constitutional pressure, the legitimacy of the state depends on that answer being delivered. The evolution is from self-audit to external oversight, but the foundational principle is exactly the same. So now we move to a contemporary constitutional system, Pakistan, where we can see a deliberate melding of these two historical streams.
Okay, so this is where the ancient and the modern come together.
Yes, the system actively incorporates both the language of that ancient trust we talked about and the necessity of modern institutional enforcement. It's a hybrid system trying to manage the ongoing mandate of accountability.
This is great because it allows us to see how a state translates a high moral duty into specific, actionable law and constitutional obligations. Let's start with the foundational legal requirement, Article 5 of the Constitution.
Article 5 is crucial. It's so important because it constitutionalizes the public duty of every citizen and specifically every official. It demands fidelity to the state and, critically, unconditional obedience to law.
And within that duty to obey the law is this implicit and sometimes explicit mandate about state finances.
Exactly. The protection of public funds. This acts as the constitutional echo of Abu Bakr's legacy. It legally cements the concept that state resources are sacrosanct, and they absolutely cannot be treated as private or political assets.
But a principle like that requires a dedicated body to police it. I mean, you're talking about billions of expenditures across a vast bureaucracy. This brings us to the Auditor-General of Pakistan, the AGP.
Right. And the AGP is designed to be the backbone of financial scrutiny in the country.
What is its operational scope? How far does its reach go?
Its mandate is incredibly expansive. It ensures that every single public expenditure is legal, properly sanctioned, and executed efficiently. It covers all the federal ministries, the provincial departments, all aspects of public money spending, huge infrastructure and development projects, and all the state-owned enterprises.
So its jurisdiction is basically everywhere that public funds are being used.
That's the idea. It ensures that this principle of financial integrity applies everywhere public money is deployed.
And unlike many audit functions globally, the AGP in Pakistan is constitutionally protected to ensure its independence, right?
Precisely. That independence is key. It allows it to act as a genuine check on the executive, and it reports its findings directly to the legislature, not to the government it's auditing.
And those reports then go somewhere. They don't just sit on a shelf.
No, the reports generated by the AGP form the basis for the Public Accounts Committee, the PAC, in Parliament, which then has the power to interrogate officials on any findings of mismanagement or misappropriation. This is the institutional translation of accountability, turning dry financial data into political oversight.
And beyond these audit mechanisms, the judiciary has taken an incredibly strong stance to reinforce this mandate. What is the Supreme Court's mandate regarding the management of public funds?
The Supreme Court has repeatedly issued rulings that elevate the ethical standard to an absolute legal doctrine. The key statement, which really serves as a warning to every civil servant and politician, is definitive.
What is it?
Every rupee of the public exchequer must be accounted for. This ruling demands not just broad reporting, but granular, verifiable transparency for all public expenditures. It basically eliminates any excuse for unexplained leakage or mismanagement.
And the sources highlight that this isn't just theory. We see it enforced in specific, high-profile judicial interventions, which makes the principle much more tangible for the listener.
Yes, exactly. The material explicitly names these landmark cases where the court intervened to protect public funds. For instance, the Pakistan steel mills case highlighted massive losses due to non-transparent privatization deals and mismanagement, forcing a judicial reckoning on accountability for state assets.
What are some others?
Well, there was the NICL case, which involved the dubious purchase of land at wildly inflated prices using national insurance funds. That directly questioned the fiduciary duty of the officials involved. And the Hajj corruption case was profoundly important.
Why that one in particular?
Because it involved defrauding poor pilgrims who were trying to fulfill a sacred religious duty. It showed corruption at its most cynical, and it forced the judiciary to step in to protect the public trust in a very direct way.
So these cases really validate the judiciary's role as the ultimate guardian of state finances, protecting them against both mismanagement and outright theft.
They do.
Let's shift to the dedicated anti-corruption mechanism. NABI Jurisprudence concerning the National Accountability Bureau. The source wisely acknowledges that despite its, and I'm quoting, political imperfections, its foundation is rooted in something much older.
And that acknowledgement of imperfections is necessary for impartial reporting, especially in complex political environments. Anti-corruption bodies often face criticism globally about selective application or procedural issues, and NABI is certainly no exception.
But we need to focus on its structural foundation.
We do. The NAB law is fundamentally rooted in those same Islamic principles of financial integrity we established back in Part 1. It's designed to prevent what was known as ghulu, the misappropriation of war booty, or by extension, any public funds. It structurally enforces that ancient moral mandate.
And what are the specific types of offenses that NAB targets that relate directly back to this concept of public trust in amana?
Well, it goes beyond simple theft. It's designed to target the systemic erosion of trust. This includes the obvious offenses like, corruption, corrupt practices, and maintaining unexplained assets that are disproportionate to your known income.
But there are two others that are really key.
Yes. The two most critical targets are misuse of authority, using one's official position for undue personal advantage, and most centrally, breach of public trust. This last element is the legal definition of violating the amana in a contemporary statutory context.
And the Supreme Court has consistently reinforced this concept of trust, using this profoundly clear, almost moral language in its judgments, which is pretty unusual for purely legal texts.
It is a very striking feature of this legal system. The source cites specific judicial declarations where the Supreme Court has explicitly stated, quote, "Public office is a sacred trust. Corruption is a betrayal of that trust."
A betrayal of that trust. That's powerful language.
It's incredibly powerful. That declaration deliberately elevates public service beyond a mere contract or employment to a solemn, almost quasi-sacred duty. So failure to adhere to the highest ethical standard isn't just a legal infringement, it's defined as a betrayal. This confirms that modern legal frameworks are actively trying to institutionalize the rigor of that early self-audit model.
Okay, so we've traced accountability through three incredibly distinct political, religious, and legal systems. Now, in Part 4, we synthesize all these lessons. This is where the deep dive really delivers that conceptual framework you can take away by comparing these mechanisms side by side.
And this comparative analysis is what's so revealing. It shows that while the cultural and the legal language differs dramatically, the core function, which is converting power into legitimacy, is identical across the board.
Let's start by comparing the initiating event, the moment accountability was actually triggered or enforced in each system.
Okay, so in the 7th century, the initiating event was the Caliph Abu Bakr returning state assets, a self-audit. The impulse was entirely internal, driven by voluntary integrity and his conscience.
Then we jump to the 20th century U.S.
And the trigger was the Watergate scandal exposing abuse, a congressional investigation. The impulse there was external, it was reactive, and it was driven by institutional checks and balances.
And finally, in modern Pakistan.
In modern Pakistan, accountability is driven by the AGP and a NAB enforcing integrity. This is a statutory or constitutional enforcement. It's a systemic approach designed to be proactive, but it's often triggered by specific audit reports or judicial complaints.
What's also fascinating is how the terminology used to define public office adapts to the legal environment, even though the core concept remains steadfastly one of guardianship.
Absolutely. In Islamic governance, the defining term is trust, amana. It emphasizes a moral and, you could argue, a divine contract with the community.
And in the U.S.
In U.S. oversight, the key legal term is fiduciary duty. And that's a powerful, enforceable legal obligation concerning the stewardship of assets and prioritizing the beneficiary, in this case, the public.
And Pakistan's system seems to merge the two.
It synthesizes them. The concept is trust under constitution, which directly merges that ancient moral ideal with modern codified law.
Okay, and the audit authority, who actually holds the power to compel disclosure, that shows a direct evolution of the state's maturity in managing power.
The evolution is crystal clear. In the earliest model, accountability was chiefly internal, moral plus legal, with leaders self-auditing. The responsibility rested almost entirely on the leader's virtue.
Then in the U.S. model, it becomes external and adversarial.
Right. It's legal plus institutional, with Congress investigating the executive. It is structurally designed so that power checks power.
And the Pakistani model, again, seems to be the most complex, maybe reflecting this layering of systems over time.
It's multi-layered and supervisory. It's constitutional plus statutory, with the courts supervising the anti-corruption bodies. The statutory bodies like NAB and the AGP conduct the operational enforcement, but the entire system is overseen by the Supreme Court, embedding judicial review as the ultimate guarantor of accountability within the constitutional framework.
But I have to ask, isn't there a fundamental contradiction here? The source attempts to draw these parallels, but comparing a system driven by, let's say, fear of the divine, which prompts a voluntary self-audit, to a system driven by fear of a subpoena, which requires forced disclosure, that seems, I don't know, a little strained.
That is the essential tension, and that's exactly why the comparison is so powerful. The source material argues that while the motive differs radically, and it does, the outcome that is being sought is identical: a clean treasury and a legitimate state.
So if you can't rely on one, you have to build the other.
That's it, exactly. If a society cannot rely on the voluntary moral integrity of its leader, which is the 7th century model, then it must institutionalize distrust, which is the 20th century model. The underlying truth is that human nature across all time is susceptible to corruption. The goal is simply to find the most effective mechanism, whether it's a moral code or a constitutional mandate, to impose the required standard of austerity and transparency.
So if we look beyond the specific mechanisms to the ratio decidendi, the fundamental reason for the ruling, or the universal conclusion shared by all three of these systems, what is that one unifying ethical thread?
The thread is the principle of political and societal survival itself. The source material states it definitively. No society can survive when rulers treat public resources as personal property. That line, that bright, clear distinction between the public purse and the private pocket, is the shared ethical DNA of all functional state systems, regardless of their religion or political structure.
So accountability, then, it isn't just some political headache or a bureaucratic process. It's a structural necessity for legitimacy.
It is. It converts raw, potentially dangerous power into regulated trust. And trust is the only thing that confers lasting legitimacy on a governing body. The moment that trust is systematically and repeatedly broken without any consequence, the entire foundation of the state, the social contract itself, begins to fracture.
Let's just quickly review the tangible historical impacts we've summarized, showing how crucial the mechanism of accountability was in each of these eras.
In the 7th century, that rigorous early standard of accountability preserved Islamic governance. It did so by establishing a foundational model based on non-corrupt leadership.
And in the 20th century.
Robust institutional accountability brought down a U.S. president, which validated the resiliency of constitutional checks and balances, even under extreme duress.
And today?
And today, the necessity of accountability remains central in Pakistan's constitutional order. It serves as the legal and moral benchmark that the judiciary and the statutory bodies are constantly trying to enforce.
So history, in this framework, really serves as the undeniable proof. The core tension is validated by centuries of evidence.
And the final conclusion the source presents, it acts as the thesis for our entire deep dive. It summarizes the fundamental choice that is inherent in power.
Power without accountability becomes corruption.
And conversely, if you can establish and maintain those stringent mechanisms, power with accountability becomes leadership. It's as simple and as difficult as that. So what this whole historical and legal journey really shows is this persistent, ongoing struggle to ensure that the ruler's immense power is always subordinate to their public duty. The mechanisms, they evolved from internal conscience to these complex external laws, but the destination always remained the same.
And that brings us to the ultimate lesson, the one that transcends specific statutes and courts. The sources argue that a clean treasury does not depend only on strong laws.
That's such a critical point.
While legal structures are the crucial safety net and they're the mechanism of enforcement, they are not the primary driver of integrity.
No, the deepest lesson is the moral one. It's the one that ties directly back to Abu Bakr's voluntary audit. Legal frameworks only succeed if there is a fundamental underlying commitment to them. It depends, ultimately, on leaders who fear the consequences, whether they are spiritual, constitutional, or institutional, more than they crave the accumulation of power and wealth.
So the most powerful check will always be the internal voluntary one.
Always.
So, with that, we leave you with a final thought. Building on this tension between moral duty and institutional law, we've seen accountability transition from a leader's deathbed request to a Senate committee subpoena. But as we look forward, the complexity of state finance is just exploding. We're moving into an era of global digital finance, decentralized ledgers, and potentially AI-driven governance systems.
A completely new world. So if self-accountability was the bedrock of the earliest state, and external institutional oversight developed thousands of years later, what hybrid form of accountability, one that combines moral duty, the rigor of constitutional law, and maybe the transparency or the immutable nature of digital ledger technology, what will be necessary to effectively police power in the age of borderless transactions and algorithmic decision-making?
Right. How do we build an audit system that's capable of forcing a zero balance in a world where transactions happen instantly and anonymously across hundreds of jurisdictions? That is the question we leave you to mull over as you process the remarkable insights from this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us for this crucial look at the enduring principles of state accountability.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.